Hey everyone! Today we're going to watch a shocking video about Rick Harrison, the star of Pawn Stars. Recently, a leaked video has shown how Rick is being treated in prison after being convicted in a major case. Does he really have to pay for his actions? Let's find out. The newly leaked video shows an unbelievable scene of Rick Harrison, the Pawn Stars star, and how he's being treated in prison. From living a life of luxury to now facing unexpected hardships and challenges, this video will make you reconsider everything about the man who was once a symbol of success. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments, and let us know what you think about the situations Rick Harrison is facing. Let's explore the hidden truths and untold stories. Pawn Stars, a reality TV show that captivated millions of viewers, turned a small pawn shop in Las Vegas into an American cultural icon. A family business promising authenticity, a slice of old America, and the feeling of holding history right in your hands. At the heart of it all was Rick Harrison, the sharp, straightforward, and often humorous man who became a familiar face on television for over a decade. Viewers followed him as he haggled over antique guns, rare coins, and signed memorabilia. But little did they know, a completely different story was slowly being revealed behind the scenes. On a fateful Wednesday morning, everything changed. No cameras, no script. But the scene in the Las Vegas courtroom was as dramatic as an episode of a TV show. Rick Harrison, now with gray hair and a tired face, stood before a federal court, surrounded by armed agents. The lights of the courtroom shone down, making beads of sweat appear on his forehead. His eyes flickered, anxious. Gone were the clever jokes, the familiar jingles of the pawn shop. Only silence and a heavy, suffocating atmosphere remained. Across the room, Pam Bondi, the former Attorney General of Florida, known for her tough courtroom style, stepped onto the floor. Each step, in her red high heels, echoed like drum beats signaling an impending showdown. In her hands, she held a black folder labeled Harrison Files, Confidential Evidence. When Bondi spoke, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. No flowery words, just direct and cold, her voice steady but sharp like a blade. "Your Honor," she said, raising a stack of documents, "what I have here is not just a collection of papers. This is the blueprint of deception. Years of tax fraud, money laundering through shell companies, and worst of all, a network of trafficked, stolen artifacts, many of which were once showcased before millions of viewers on national television." The entire room was eerily silent. In that moment, the image of Rick Harrison, the man passionate about history, appraising antiques with expertise and a hint of sarcasm, completely crumbled. In its place was the portrait of someone accused of exploiting his fame, betraying public trust, and concealing millions of dollars through a decades-long network of covert transactions. Whispers began to spread throughout the room. Could this really be true? Could the man who built a career on trust and authenticity be the one manipulating everything behind the scenes? Was the American dream sold at the gold and silver pawn shop just a cleverly crafted facade hiding a much darker truth? Within hours, the media erupted. Headlines flooded the internet and newspapers. Pawn Stars star Rick Harrison breaks down in court. Pam Bondi presents the evidence. Harrison faces life sentence. History stolen. What Rick Harrison hid all these years. This was not just a legal collapse. It was a cultural earthquake. Fans were stunned. Critics were shocked. And at the center of it all was the man who once greeted millions of viewers with a smile, now facing the prospect of a life sentence. But how did it come to this? To understand the gravity of what transpired in that courtroom, we need to rewind, far back, before the fame, before the bargaining, before the cameras. Because Rick Harrison didn't wake up one day and decide to commit federal crimes. It was a slow, steady decline, a moral corruption cleverly disguised under the guise of sharp business acumen. Thousands of small decisions had piled up, leading to the downfall of a multi-million-dollar empire. The story begins in San Diego, 1965. Rick was born into a family that had faced numerous hardships. Diagnosed with epilepsy at just 8 years old, much of his childhood was spent bedridden, isolated, and glued to the TV screen. Historical documentaries became his escape, and, ironically, also his future. Later, he would say that those years taught him two things: how to observe people and how to survive. As a teenager, the Harrison family moved to Las Vegas. Rick dropped out of school in the 10th grade, not because he wasn't intelligent, but because he felt there was something he needed to prove. He began buying and selling goods, watches, sound systems, rare books. His talent for business was undeniable. In 1989, Rick and his father, Richard Old Man Harrison, opened the Gold and Silver Pawn Shop. The business was steady but unremarkable until Pawn Stars hit the airwaves in 2009. This reality TV show turned them into a pop culture phenomenon overnight. From a rundown shop on the edge of the Las Vegas Strip, Gold and Silver Pawn Shop became a famous destination. A place where celebrities, collectors, and ordinary people came to negotiate over the past. The show was designed to appear unscripted. A little humor, a little conflict, and always a lesson about history. But while the cameras portrayed Rick as a man passionate about truth and real value, the truth became harder to find behind the closed doors. According to Pam Bondi's investigation, things started to spiral downhill after Pawn Stars reached its peak fame. The newfound massive wealth brought both opportunities and temptations. Rick expanded his operations. He collaborated with appraisers, auction houses, and private collectors. The line between legal and profit-driven became increasingly blurry. Tax records showed unreported income from high-value items. Money flows were channeled through shell companies and traced to foreign accounts. Payments came from anonymous buyers who never appeared on invoices. And perhaps the most damning evidence, several iconic items featured on the show: a Civil War-era sword, a Native American ceremonial pipe, and even a unique Picasso sketch, were flagged by international law enforcement agencies as stolen artifacts. Viewers had witnessed these items being appraised and traded like ordinary goods. But in reality, these transactions were anything but ordinary. Bondi's investigative team scoured over a decade of the show, cross-referencing on-screen transactions with physical evidence seized from the pawn shop's storage and Rick's personal safes. What they uncovered was staggering. Some items had legally questionable origins, others were outright illegal. If you find this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated with the latest news. Join us in the discussion and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think about Rick Harrison's situation? Let's watch the video to learn more. Forensic financial experts worked for months to trace the money trail. Invoices were altered. Accounting books vanished. Employees who once laughed in front of the cameras were now summoned to court, filled with fear. Some cooperated with investigators, while others were indicted. When Rick was arrested, federal prosecutors had what one source described as an irrefutable case. Over 100 pieces of evidence, 17 stolen artifacts confirmed, and millions of dollars in unreported revenue. The charges weren't just procedural. They were meticulously prepared, strategic, and sharp. The trial soon became a media frenzy. Rick appeared in a dark gray suit, escorted by his team of lawyers, who appeared more panicked than ready to fight. The prosecution wasted no time. They started with the tax evasion charges, simple, clear, and easy to understand. Next came money laundering, a complex chain of transactions shifting between companies that only existed on paper. And finally, the knockout blow, trafficking stolen cultural artifacts. That was when Pam Bondi stood up, beginning to present the receipts, each transaction, each item, each day, every detail. A former FBI analyst who later followed the trial remarked that Bondi treated the case as if she were investigating a murder. Each artifact was a victim. Each falsified invoice was a fingerprint. And Rick, he was standing in the lineup. Rick's breakdown in court didn't come when he heard about the alleged amount of money or the potential life sentence awaiting him. It came when Bondi held up a photo of a stolen Torah scroll from a Holocaust museum in Poland, an item Rick had purchased in cash and never registered. He didn't cry because he felt guilty. He cried because he was scared. Because at that moment, even Rick knew there would be no pawn shop ticket that could redeem what was coming his way. Outside, the world reacted in real time. Pawn Stars was quietly removed from streaming platforms. The Google reviews for the pawn shop flooded with comments ranging from heartbroken to furious. Fans posted side-by-side images comparing favorite episodes and trial footage, unable to believe that both images belonged to the same person. News networks aired special programs warning of the dangers of idolizing reality TV stars. Even former colleagues from the show publicly distanced themselves from Rick. This was an unprecedented fall in the history of reality television. But no matter how loud the headlines were, there was still much that hadn't been revealed. Because this case wasn't just about Rick Harrison. It was about those around him. The unbroadcasted deals, the employees who knew too much, the artifacts that may never be recovered, and a prosecutor determined not to stop. This wasn't just the story of one man's downfall. It was the story of the cost of deception, the price of fame, and what happens when history, literally, becomes a commodity. What you've just read is only the surface. The question is, are you ready to see how deep it goes? Long before Rick Harrison became a TV icon, he was just a child trying to find his place in the world. No cameras, no signatures, no multi-million-dollar pawn empire. Instead, it was silence, struggles, and a bedroom that turned into a prison. Rick was born on March 22, 1965, in Lexington, North Carolina, the third child in a modest family. His father, Richard Benjamin Harrison, later known as Old Man, was a U.S. Navy veteran with a sharp tongue and an even sharper intuition. His mother, Joan Rue, was a real estate agent, practical and tough. But their life wasn't easy. The family frequently moved, chasing opportunities and jobs, finally settling in San Diego, California. At the age of 8, Rick was diagnosed with epilepsy. The seizures would come suddenly and unpredictably, causing his body to betray him without warning, often leaving him bedridden for days. Doctors told his family that there was no cure, only management. For an energetic and curious boy, that diagnosis felt like a sentence. School became a challenge. Not because Rick was a poor student, quite the opposite, he was quick to learn with an innate thirst for knowledge, but because of the social environment. The other children didn't understand his condition. The teachers didn't know how to handle it. And so, Rick withdrew. He stopped trying to fit in. He immersed himself in books, and more importantly, in the world of television. Day after day, as seizures forced him to stay in bed, Rick would dive into TV programs for hours. But unlike most kids who were hooked on cartoons, Rick was fascinated by historical documentaries. Ancient Rome, World War II, the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution. He soaked it all in like a sponge. Dates, events, facts. All of it became imprinted in his memory. Rick began to recognize patterns, started questioning motivations, and slowly developed a strange but profound respect for the past. This passion for history would shape his entire future, though no one could see that at the time. When Rick turned 17, his life took another turn. He dropped out of school before completing 10th grade. But this wasn't the story of a failure. It was a choice, a calculated decision. By then, Rick had already started buying and selling small items, high-end calculators, audio equipment. He had discovered the only thing that could make people stop doubting his condition: money. Las Vegas called to the Harrison family, just as it had for many others, a land of opportunity, a city where reinvention was a way of life. In 1981, the whole family packed up and moved to Vegas. It was here that Rick's instincts became sharper, honed by a city built on risk and deception. He worked in his father's pawn shop, not just learning how to appraise goods, but also learning about people, how to read them, how to negotiate, and most importantly, how to close a deal. However, the business didn't come easy. Competition was fierce. The traditional second-hand goods model wasn't enough to keep the family afloat. Then a turning point came. Rick proposed switching the shop's model from second-hand goods to pawnbrokering. But there was a major obstacle. Las Vegas laws at the time only allowed a limited number of pawn licenses. The waiting list was long, and the opportunity was slim. Rick did what he always did. He waited. He studied. And when a license finally became available in 1989, he and his father were ready. They opened Gold and Silver Pawn Shop on Las Vegas Boulevard, just a few blocks from the Strip. The location wasn't glamorous. The sign was simple. But inside, something different was happening. The Harrisons weren't just accepting gold chains and guitars. They were trading stories. Each item had a history. Each transaction was not just a negotiation over price, but also over meaning. Rick had an encyclopedic memory for odd details, and customers began to take notice. Word spread. Locals came to see if the rumors were true, that there was a pawn shop owner in Vegas who knew more about a war medal than the veteran who owned it. Over time, the shop became a local destination. They had seen it all, from shrunken heads to Fabergé eggs. Rick never stopped expanding his knowledge. He read incessantly, traveled to attend auctions, estate sales, and built relationships with experts nationwide. He wasn't just building a business, he was building a brand. Then, a phone call came that would change his life. In the early 2000s, reality TV exploded. Producers were hunting for new formats, untapped markets. One of them walked into Gold and Silver Pawn Shop looking for something interesting, and found Rick. The concept for Pawn Stars was simple: a reality TV show set in the family pawn shop, focusing on strange, rare, and even ridiculous items. But Rick had conditions. He didn't want the show to be just a collection of scripted, manufactured drama. He wanted it to teach history. He wanted viewers to walk away with something they hadn't known before. And somehow, he got what he wanted. In 2009, Pawn Stars debuted on the History Channel. The show immediately became a massive hit. Viewers were captivated. They loved the mix of quirky items, tense negotiations, and the behind-the-scenes banter between Rick, his son Corey, childhood friend Chumley, and of course the gruff wisdom of Old Man Richard. But what truly made the show a success was Rick. He was intelligent, confident, and straightforward. He wasn't easily fooled, but wasn't ruthless either. He made knowledge cool. He turned bargaining into an art form. He brought history to life. The success came like a whirlwind. The show quickly became one of the highest rated on cable television. It spawned spin-offs, merchandise, book deals, and invitations to appear everywhere. Rick became a bona fide celebrity. He was invited to speak at business conferences, made cameo appearances in films, and even served as a consultant for museums. The gold and silver pawn shop transformed from a local store into a global tourist destination. People from all over the world flocked to see where history was bought and sold. On any given day, hundreds of visitors lined up outside the shop, hoping to catch a glimpse of Rick in action. But fame is a double-edged sword. Along with success came pressure. The shop's inventory had to be constantly refreshed to keep the audience engaged. The line between performance and authenticity began to blur. Deals grew larger, items became more valuable, and the numbers on tax forms became harder to read. Rick started investing in side projects, some legitimate, some dubious. He secretly bought real estate in Vegas. He poured money into private collections. He began trading not just antiques, but influence. Experts were paid to authenticate items without proper verification. Some documents disappeared. Others were forged. By the time federal authorities took notice, Rick was running a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts. However, from the outside, his empire still seemed solid. The show was still airing. The ratings were steady. The fans remained loyal. To them, Rick Harrison was still the man who loved history, adored his father, and had achieved the American dream. But behind the scenes, cracks had begun to appear. The Rick Harrison of that time was no longer the boy lying in bed reading books alone. He was a businessman with too many secrets and too much to lose. According to court records released later, this was the period when Rick made his biggest mistakes, not just legally, but morally. He no longer questioned whether what he was doing was right. He only asked if it was possible. And in Las Vegas, anything is possible, if the price is right. Rick once said in an interview, "Every item has a story, and every story has a price." What he didn't realize, or perhaps didn't want to admit, was that his own life story was being rewritten. Not by his fans, not by the cameras, but by the prosecutors. Rick Harrison's rise was truly remarkable. It was ambitious. It had the distinct flavor of the American identity, but the higher you climb, the harder you fall. The first taste of fame was addictive. For Rick Harrison, it hit like a lightning bolt. One day he was just a local businessman in Vegas known for his smarts and charm. The next day he was a nationwide celebrity. His face appeared on screens in over 150 countries. Pawn Stars didn't just make Rick rich. It made him a cultural icon. Suddenly, he was more than just a pawn shop owner. He was an expert in the value of America. The show, with its unique blend of pop culture, historical knowledge, and dramatic negotiations, quickly found an audience. People saw Rick as a trustworthy storyteller, someone who could spot a genuine Civil War sword in an instant, and even name the general who once wielded it. He seemed like an honest man, someone who respected history and had an eye for authenticity. But with that fame came something far more dangerous, the illusion of invincibility. Rick never shied away from the spotlight. In interviews, he played up his image, a self-made man, living for his family, and straightforward to the core. But behind the scenes, fame was quietly changing him. The line between Rick's true self and his televised image began to blur. As Pawn Stars became incredibly popular, Rick's shop transformed from a local store into a landmark in Vegas. Tour buses started adding the location to their must-visit lists. Hundreds of tourists lined up daily just to snap a photo, even if they didn't buy anything. Rick-branded merchandise, T-shirts, bobblehead dolls, coffee mugs with his face and famous sayings flew off the shelves. Rick signed book deals, held speaking engagements, and traveled by private jet to events, all while the cameras were always rolling. In the beginning, the fame was still manageable. Rick used it as a tool, a way to elevate the pawn industry, making it more respected in society. He even talked about educating the public, sharing history through objects. And for a time, that was true. But then, everything changed. The more famous Rick became, the more his business model shifted, evolving into something unrecognizable. The pawn shop, once proud of its honest negotiations and community ties, gradually started catering to the cameras and celebrity guests. Real collectors and tough sellers were pushed aside in favor of people who looked good on TV. Items were staged, scenes were rehearsed, deals were adjusted to increase drama. And Rick, who was once obsessed with detail and truth, began to turn a blind eye. It was the employees who noticed first. The focus was no longer on valuing items, but on maintaining the image. Some longtime employees quietly left. Others stayed, drawn in by the fame, the paycheck, or the fear of missing out on an opportunity to appear on one of the most watched reality shows. Then the parties began. Las Vegas has a way of stripping people down to their true nature, and for Rick, it exposed his growing thirst for luxury. He was spotted in high-end clubs, gambling at high-stakes tables, and mingling with people who had no connection to the pawn business. Hollywood producers, art dealers, foreign officials. All of them wanted a piece of the man who had turned junk into treasure. Deals were discussed over cocktails, antiques exchanged in private rooms. Some of these items had never appeared on the show. They weren't flashy enough, but they were incredibly valuable. Some were worth so much that their appearance on the open market would draw the attention of authorities. At first, Rick ignored the concerns. He had a lawyer. He had an accountant. He believed he was just playing the same game as everyone else, only smarter. But beneath the surface, the risks kept building up. A few appraisers who had appeared on Pawn Stars later admitted in private interviews that they had been pressured to inflate values. Items with questionable provenance were often verified with nothing more than a handshake and a wink. The production crew wasn't there to authenticate artifacts. They were there to film a TV show. And Rick was the star. No one questioned the star. Uncontrolled power became addictive. Rick began buying expensive items without proper documentation. He started using intermediaries to acquire rare antiques from private collections. Many of these items were believed to have been smuggled out of the countries where they originated. Ancient scrolls, ritual weapons, rare coins, and even religious artifacts. Some were thought to be missing from museum records. Rick justified it all. He wasn't stealing. He was preserving history. He was keeping those items safe. That was the story he told himself. That was the mask he wore. But cracks began to appear. Behind the facade, Rick's financial situation became increasingly complex. He set up a network of LLCs, some of which existed only on paper. Money was shuffled between accounts with no clear purpose. Many items disappeared from the shop's records. Items sold off-camera never appeared on tax reports. The value of his personal collection, stored in a temperature-controlled vault beneath his house, began to rival the assets of some museums. And yet, the show continued. Pawn Stars still held strong ratings. Rick remained the symbol of trust, a living encyclopedia of cultural value. No one questioned where he was getting these rare items. No one asked why some transactions weren't transparent. And Rick, emboldened by years of public adoration, began to believe he could outsmart anyone, even the federal government. The turning point came quietly. A whistleblower, believed to be a former employee, filed an anonymous report with the IRS. Not about the antiques, but about taxes, unreported income, questionable deductions, and large, unusual transactions through shell companies. At first, it seemed normal, a famous person with a complicated financial life. But as investigators dug deeper, they discovered something far more serious. Money was being laundered. Items that had been flagged as stolen in international databases were sitting in Rick's private vault. Artifacts with unclear origins were being transported across state and national borders, sometimes by private jet, sometimes labeled as TV props. That's when Pam Bondi entered the picture. The former Attorney General of Florida, known for pursuing high-profile financial crime cases, saw Rick Harrison's case not only as a legal challenge but also as a cultural one. A man who had built his reputation on valuing authenticity was about to be exposed as a master of deception. Her investigation would span years, involve multiple agencies, and include testimonies from dozens of former employees, appraisers, and international collectors. What she uncovered was not just illegal, it was systematic. It was intentional. Rick Harrison hadn't stumbled into crime. He had built an empire from it. As the case began to take shape, the fame that had once protected Rick now became a weapon against him. Every episode of Pawn Stars became a potential piece of evidence. Every public statement could be scrutinized. Every interview was reviewed with a new perspective. Fame had granted Rick Harrison access, influence, and power. It also brought him enemies, exposure, and ultimately, downfall. The trap of fame is subtle. It doesn't show its fangs until it's too late. One moment, you're the face of a brand. The next, you're the subject of a federal investigation. Rick Harrison believed he could control the narrative, that he could walk the line between reality and entertainment, business and crime. But as Pam Bondi would soon prove in court, reality always finds a way to catch up. The man who had appraised the value of everything had forgotten to ask about the moral value of himself, and now he would have to pay the price. For months, Rick Harrison's name quietly appeared in government circles as an enigma no one could solve. On paper, everything seemed legal, profitable, even admirable. This man had helped the public understand history, raised awareness about priceless antiques, and boosted tourism in Las Vegas. But beneath the headlines, the whispers grew louder. Something was wrong. Then Pam Bondi appeared. Her reputation preceded her. She was the former Attorney General of Florida, a figure both admired and feared, often simultaneously. She was known for taking down corruption with precision and meticulousness. She didn't just bring criminals to justice, she dismantled them publicly, methodically, and thoroughly. When the IRS and FBI realized that Rick Harrison's case went beyond missed tax payments or bookkeeping errors, they realized they needed more than just auditors. They needed a hammer. Pam Bondi was that hammer. She didn't enter the case with fanfare. She didn't hold press conferences. She started quietly, poring over documents, contacting confidential sources, and assembling a team of forensic accountants and artifact recovery experts. She treated the investigation like a defensive campaign. Every detail mattered. Every name, every dollar, every artifact had to lead somewhere. What Bondi uncovered left her astonished. Everything began with analyzing Harrison's tax records over the past 12 years. Dozens of inconsistencies surfaced. Large transfers of money to companies in the Cayman Islands. Deductions for items that were never listed in the store's inventory. Real estate transactions through shell companies. Loans issued and repaid with no clear source of income. Each of these transactions could have a separate explanation, but when pieced together, they painted a picture of deliberate deception. Bondi dug deeper. She contacted international law enforcement agencies, museums, and auction houses. The more calls she made, the more concerning the responses became. There were missing artifacts, items listed in global stolen asset databases, and some of them matched items Rick had publicly displayed on Pawn Stars. One particular item sent a chill down her spine when it was confirmed. A 16th-century religious manuscript, reported missing from a small church in Italy, had appeared in an early season of the show. Rick had bought it for $18,000 and later resold it for 3 times that amount. When asked about the item at the time, he had just laughed and remarked, "You don't find things like this every day." Bondi was no longer investigating a man simply negligent with his finances. She was unraveling the activities of someone who had cleverly woven criminal behavior into the very structure of his business. She ordered a raid. Federal agents, acting on a sealed search warrant, combed through the gold and silver pawn shop, Rick's residence, and several storage units across the state. What they found confirmed Bondi's worst suspicions. Hundreds of artifacts, some intact, some with missing labels, and some with nothing at all. Many lacked traceable ownership history. Some matched descriptions of items that had been lost or reported stolen, dating back years, even decades. Among the seized items were a set of ancient scrolls believed to be from Israel, a medieval war helmet missing from a German museum since the 1970s, and a collection of South American tribal masks with origins tied to private collectors who had reported them missing after a suspicious asset liquidation. These were not items Rick had accidentally come across. They were artifacts that had been trafficked, exchanged, and concealed from public records with intention. Bondi didn't stop there. She reviewed hours of unaired footage from Pawn Stars obtained through a subpoena of the production company. It revealed transactions and off-camera conversations that had been edited, painting a very different picture of the business. In one clip, Rick could be heard telling a seller to keep quiet about the origins of an item in exchange for a higher payment. Another segment showed him brushing off an expert's concerns about the legality of an item with a shrug and the remark, "They'll never track it, not with what I've got on hand." Bondi's response was swift. She filed charges of tax evasion, money laundering, and trafficking in stolen artifacts. Each charge carried the potential for serious prison time. Together, they represented the possibility of life imprisonment. However, Bondi knew the trial wouldn't be easy. Rick was a famous public figure, beloved by fans, seen as trustworthy, even noble. Convincing a jury that he wasn't just careless but a criminal would require more than just paper evidence. She needed a story rooted in truth, a story that couldn't be ignored. That's when she began preparing what would later be called the evidence. A stack of 3 feet of documents, copies, ledgers, contracts, and digital records, all meticulously compiled, cross-checked, and time-stamped. She practiced her opening statements like generals preparing for an assault. Every word was crafted to disarm, every pause calculated to control the room. When the trial began, Bondi didn't just have a case, she had a story of greed, manipulation, betrayal, and evidence. And she wasn't done yet. As pre-trial hearings continued, Bondi called witnesses that no one expected. A former accountant of Rick's, who had been fired under suspicious circumstances. A former producer of the show, who confessed to taking bribes to overlook discrepancies in the paperwork. Even a former European collector who testified via satellite from Paris that he had sold an item to Rick under false pretenses, only to later discover that the item had been illegally resold through an offshore transaction. Each testimony added another piece to the puzzle. Rick's defense team attempted to fight back. They called it a witch hunt. They blamed overzealous prosecutors and claimed there was a misunderstanding about how the pawn industry operated. But the weight of the evidence Bondi presented crushed each of those arguments, one by one. In a particularly brutal cross-examination, Bondi confronted Rick's lead attorney with a forged invoice dated the same day Rick was attending a charity gala in Miami. The invoice stated that Rick had personally authenticated an artifact at his pawn shop. Bondi simply raised an eyebrow and asked, "Is he a magician?" The courtroom erupted in laughter. Rick did not. The public's attitude began to shift, from skepticism to curiosity, then to concern, and finally to outrage. News outlets began running headlines not only about the trial, but also about Pam Bondi, about how a prosecutor had taken down a man too famous to fall. She was praised, feared, and admired. In interviews, she remained calm, focused, and precise. "This case isn't about fame. It's about responsibility," she told reporters. "No one stands above the law. Not even someone who built a career on appraising rare and priceless objects, because ethics are priceless too." But the most powerful moment came when Bondi presented the entire case before the court. Every detail was carefully arranged, each layer building upon the next. She described the theft of culture, the laundering of history, and the manipulation of audiences who had trusted what they saw. And then, in a steady but resolute voice, she looked at Rick and said, "You built your reputation by appraising objects. But you forgot one thing that can't be appraised and can't be pawned: integrity." Rick turned away. In that moment, everyone understood. This trial wasn't just about punishing a man. It was about reclaiming the truth. And Pam Bondi was not just a prosecutor. She was the defender of that truth. The public's trust in Rick Harrison shattered. But Bondi didn't celebrate. To her, this wasn't a victory. It was a necessary cleansing. And the cleansing had only just begun. Because it was never just about the accusations. In high-profile criminal cases, accusations are often seen as sensational. Public opinion always wavers between belief and doubt. But what separates speculation from certainty, what truly shatters the mask, is clear and irrefutable evidence. And that's exactly what Pam Bondi brought when she walked into the courtroom, holding a stack of meticulously compiled documents. That stack of documents would later be given a nickname by the reporters following the case: the receipts. These were not just spreadsheets or scribbled notes. They were detailed, time-stamped, notarized, and cross-verified documents, collected from years of financial records, surveillance footage, expert testimonies, subpoenaed emails, and even international cooperation. It wasn't just a smoking gun. It was an entire arsenal. The courtroom was packed that day. The atmosphere was palpable, heavy enough to be felt. Every spectator, journalist, and legal expert knew they were about to witness a pivotal moment, a moment that would determine whether Rick Harrison was merely careless or actually calculating. Pam Bondi stepped forward and placed the file on the prosecutor's table with a deliberate slowness, making the entire room lean in her direction. She didn't open the file with a dramatic flourish, but with the sharp confidence of a surgeon, she flipped to the first page. "Let's start with the money," she said. The first part of the evidence exposed a decade-long financial manipulation scheme. Bondi began with the tax evasion charges, a serious crime in itself. Rick's financial reports over the years showed revenue from his pawn shop and television appearances, but according to the testimony of forensic accountants, those figures didn't tell the whole story. Dozens of large payments, some reaching into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, had been funneled through companies registered in the Caribbean, specifically the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. On paper, these companies had vague business purposes like consulting, investment, or artifacts trading. But when Bondi's team traced the money, they found that most of these companies existed only on paper. One company, Bronze Vault Holdings LLC, had received a $750,000 wire transfer from Rick's personal account. That money was then broken down into smaller amounts and transferred to accounts in Panama and Zurich. The problem was, there were no invoices, no contracts, and no recorded transactions. Just money vanishing into a financial maze. Another document was shocking. It showed that Rick had reported purchasing an unidentified historical artifact for $320,000. When investigators traced the item, they couldn't find it in the inventory or on the TV show. It was a ghost transaction, created to legitimize a massive tax deduction. Bondi pointed to the screen behind her, where the findings of the IRS audit team were being displayed for the jury. Each number was a nail in the coffin. "This is not careless accounting," Bondi said. "This is a system built to deceive, a structure designed to hide." But it didn't stop at money. The next section of the receipts shifted the focus to the artifacts, items that had been bought, sold, and displayed without clear provenance. Bondi highlighted 17 specific items that had raised suspicions during the investigation. Each one had a story, a history, and a missing origin. One of the most shocking items was a centuries-old Torah scroll, believed to have been stolen during World War II from a Jewish family in Poland. The scroll had been missing for decades, until it appeared in Rick's personal collection. He had bought it from a private dealer in Prague through an intermediary company to complete the transaction. The transaction documents had been falsified. The identifying marks had been erased. Bondi held up a photo of the scroll, now carefully restored and encased behind protective glass. "This isn't just paper and ink," she said. "This is sacred. This is someone's history." And it was traded like a souvenir. The courtroom fell silent. More artifacts continued to be presented. A Native American ceremonial pipe, reported stolen from a museum in New Mexico. A 15th-century samurai sword missing from a private collection in Osaka. A Roman coin believed to have been illegally excavated from an archaeological site in Tunisia. One by one, Bondi detailed how these artifacts had ended up in Rick Harrison's hands. Each time, she traced the payment trail, the forged documents, and the shell companies. The prosecution called in experts to verify the artifacts and explain their cultural significance. One historian testified, "These artifacts don't just belong in glass cases, they belong to the community, to the nation, to their stories." The emails presented in court revealed that Rick had negotiated transactions using phrases like, "Don't ask questions," and "keep this quiet." In another email, Rick instructed a third party to ship an item with falsified documents, saying, "Just like last time." These messages were not ambiguous. They were admissions. Bondi also revealed records of private flights used to transport artifacts. A chartered plane under the name of a shell company had flown over $1 million worth of undeclared historical goods from Istanbul to Las Vegas. The passenger list showed Rick was aboard. These items never appeared in the pawn shop's inventory, never made it to the TV show, and were later found in the secret basement under his home. The defense attempted to argue that Rick wasn't directly involved in every transaction, that he trusted his team and advisors. But Bondi was prepared. She presented text messages, contracts signed by Rick, and security footage from the pawn shop showing Rick personally inspecting seized artifacts, just days after they were shipped. Everything was overwhelming, not just because of the quantity of evidence, but because of its precision and cohesion. Each piece was connected, layer upon layer, undeniable. Then came the surveillance footage. The FBI had seized months of data from Rick's home and storage facilities. One clip showed Rick entering at night, moving boxes labeled archival materials into a secret area in his basement. In another, he was recorded speaking to a guest, saying that some items would never see the light of day unless the price was right. The prosecution paused the video and zoomed in on a notebook Rick was holding. This notebook, seized during a search, contained coded entries, the names of artifacts, their purchase prices, resale prices. Some entries were marked with red dots. Bondi looked at the jury and said, "Each red dot is a lie he thought he could bury." The courtroom fell silent. Legal experts following the case in real time began to realize that this was no longer just about a pawn shop or a TV show. This was a story about a man who had exploited fame and trust to hide crimes that spanned borders and violated international laws. And Rick, he sat still, hands clasped, eyes cast down. Pam Bondi concluded her presentation of evidence not with a powerful speech, but with a silence that carried weight. She placed the final document on the table and looked directly at the jury. "This is not a mistake. This is a person who made a choice. Time and time again he chose profit over truth. He chose himself over history. And now it's time to choose justice." The judge declared a recess. No one moved. Reporters kept writing. Jurors whispered among themselves. The public's perception of Rick Harrison, the once trusted face of American reality TV, had completely shattered. Those receipts didn't just prove guilt. They changed the entire narrative. This was no longer a bargaining game over a baseball card or haggling over a signed guitar. This was a crime concealed in plain sight, wrapped in the glow of television lights, and sold under the guise of family entertainment. And from that moment on, the story would never be the same. For years, Rick Harrison had built the image of a tight-knit business, a family-run pawn shop where loyalty was valued and trust was the currency. From the outside, everything at Gold and Silver Pawn Shop seemed perfect. Father and son, old friends turned colleagues, generations bound by labor and shared values. But as the legal noose began to tighten, the truth became far more fragile. The first cracks didn't appear under the stage lights. They began behind closed doors, in hushed meetings, brief phone calls, and the long silences between colleagues who once laughed together on TV. And when Rick Harrison's case went public, the image he had so carefully crafted began to crumble, piece by piece, betrayal by betrayal. The government's strategy was simple: apply pressure to the inner circle. Rick couldn't act alone. He couldn't. The scale of the crime, the forgery, the sophisticated money laundering network, the overseas deals, all of it required a support network. Someone had to help, whether voluntarily or under duress. And now, many of them were being presented with a choice: loyalty or freedom. The first to speak out wasn't someone many would expect. It was Melissa Gordon, a financial assistant at the pawn shop, someone the public rarely saw but who had worked alongside Rick for nearly a decade. She handled bills, checked the books, and signed off on the daily cash reports. Melissa had never spoken ill of Rick, nor sought attention. But when federal agents knocked on her door with a subpoena and evidence in hand, she broke. Her testimony was a turning point in the case. In a sworn affidavit, Melissa described a culture of manipulation within the company. She said she had been instructed to create 2 sets of books, one for internal use and one for tax purposes. She was told there were transactions that were never to leave the room. Worse, she admitted she knew some of the items purchased had suspicious origins. "I asked," she said, her voice trembling on the stand. "I asked Rick about an item that had no serial number, no paperwork. He said, 'Don't worry, it's clean enough.'" The courtroom was shaken. The 2 words "clean enough" echoed throughout the rest of the trial. Melissa's confession opened the floodgates. The next to testify was Dean Carson, a longtime security supervisor and logistics manager for Rick's private vault. He admitted to personally overseeing the receipt of several unregistered artifacts, sometimes at night, sometimes through the back door, always paid in cash. "Did you ever ask where they came from?" the prosecutor asked. "I asked once," Carson replied. He said, "Once it's in my hands, it's mine." That brief answer painted a vivid picture of Rick's mentality. Ownership was determined by possession. Legality was replaced by confidence. A man who believed his reputation absolved him from all rules. But the most shocking testimony came from someone the TV audience knew very well: Corey Harrison, Rick's son. For years, Corey had stood by his father, both on-screen and off. He was seen as the heir apparent, a sharp negotiator many believed would eventually take over the pawn shop. But as the trial went on, it was clear Corey had been kept in the dark, or worse, excluded when things got dirty. Under immense pressure and the public's watchful eye, Corey finally agreed to testify. What he revealed stunned everyone. He said that several years ago, he began noticing irregularities. Items disappeared from the vault with no trace. Sales transactions were recorded without a buyer's name. One time, he questioned a $150,000 transaction that was processed through a consulting firm that hadn't existed for 6 months. "I talked about this with my dad," Corey recalled. "I was pinned down." He said his father told him not to ask questions, that there were things bigger than the shop, bigger than the store itself. Those words hit the room with immense weight, This wasn't just about business. This was about secrets, power, and perhaps fear. Corey admitted that his relationship with Rick had become strained over the years. While they still appeared close on television, behind the scenes, they hardly spoke. He said Rick had started distancing himself, spending more time in private meetings, on trips to Europe, and on deals unrelated to the family or the shop. "I thought maybe he was just growing the business," Corey said. "Now I realize he was protecting something." Hiding something. Even Chumley, the one who brought humor to the show and who had always publicly defended Rick, was called to testify. While he wasn't directly involved in the criminal activities, his words carried emotional weight. He described a growing sense of unease in the final years of the show, a shift in energy, a change in Rick. "There was a time when Rick cared about every little detail," Chumley said. "Recently, it felt like he just wanted to get the deal done quickly. No questions, just move on." Chumley admitted he had seen Rick paying cash for items in the alleys behind the shop. He had been asked to stay in the store during some deliveries, and when he asked, Rick refused to answer. "He always had an answer," Chumley said. "But after a while, I stopped asking. Maybe I didn't want to know." This feeling echoed through every testimony, a blend of regret, fear, and betrayal. Some employees said they felt trapped, not knowing whether they should quit and face suspicion or stay on and risk being complicit. Some stayed because they believed in Rick. They thought he knew what he was doing, that he was too smart to get caught. But now, with the full force of the law closing in, the legend of Rick Harrison was crumbling. The inner circle wasn't just falling apart, it was self-destructing. One of the final witnesses called to the stand was Maria Thorne, a retired customs officer who had previously worked with Rick on legal artifact imports. She described a time when she became concerned about Rick's methods and severed ties. "I warned him," she said. "I told him the paperwork trails were too thin, that if the government came looking, he wouldn't be able to hide it." Rick's reaction, according to her, was to smile and say, "They're not coming. I'm golden on TV." That arrogance, that belief in his own invincibility, had been the thread holding his empire together. But now, that thread was unraveling, and those who helped build the empire were stepping forward, not out of loyalty, but out of necessity. Prosecutors played messages between Rick and his close advisors. One message read, "If it comes to that, just stay quiet. We're all in this together." But the Brotherhood, which had once been so carefully cultivated, was now nothing more than a house of cards. By the weekend, Bondi had exposed not just a series of crimes. She had revealed a culture of silence, threats, and unchecked power. Rick Harrison, who once claimed to value loyalty above all else, was now watching his most trusted allies testify against him in court. And perhaps the most significant moment didn't come from the evidence, but from Rick himself. When Corey stepped down from the witness stand, he glanced quickly at his father. Rick didn't look back at him. He didn't nod. He didn't move. He just turned away. The silence between them spoke louder than any words. The empire Rick had built wasn't just crumbling because of the law. It was crumbling because those who had once stood beside him, his inner circle, his friends, and his family, were turning their backs and walking away. For years, whispers had spread around Rick Harrison's private collection. Fans of the show had endlessly speculated online about what he might be keeping behind those closed doors. Items too rare to sell, heirlooms, objects with sentimental value too great to part with. But what no one had ever imagined not even his closest friends and employees, was that beneath the surface of his vast Las Vegas property, Rick had built something far more ominous. A vault. Not just any vault, but a climate-controlled, high-security storage room built beneath the guest house. Its door was designed to blend into a wall of the wine cellar. There was no external sign, no architectural plans made public. It had been constructed through a contractor who later admitted under questioning that he had been paid in cash and forced to keep it secret. This vault would become the center of a massive federal operation, and when it was opened, it turned Rick Harrison's criminal case from serious to explosive. The existence of this vault was first discovered during a raid on Harrison's home. Federal agents, based on information from forensic accountants, suspected that some unreported artifacts might not have been stored at the pawn shop but hidden in his private residence. Surveillance footage and bank records indicated large shipments being delivered not to the store but to his home. But when agents arrived, they initially couldn't find anything. The house, though luxurious, appeared unremarkable. There were no obvious safes, no large display rooms, no evidence of a private museum. That changed when one investigator noticed a slight discrepancy in the house's floor plan. According to real estate documents, the lower level was listed as over 5,000 square feet, but when measured, only about 4,300 square feet were accounted for. Around 700 square feet was unaccounted for. It was a small detail, but it opened up the entire case. When agents returned with engineers and thermal tools, they discovered a hidden layer of insulation behind a wall in the wine cellar. Among the wine racks and decorative crates, a false door opened into a hallway with reinforced concrete walls. At the end of that hallway was the vault. The door used fingerprint recognition, retina scanning, and a backup code known only to Rick. It took over 2 hours and a team of locksmiths to open it. What was inside exceeded all expectations. The shelves were filled from floor to ceiling with items, each carefully organized, labeled, and preserved. But unlike a personal collection of historical artifacts, the items inside were not listed in any official records. There were no legal documents confirming ownership, no auction receipts, no sales invoices. Instead, the vault contained artifacts that had disappeared from public records, items only found in museum registries, stolen property databases, and black market archives. One shelf held a set of ancient Egyptian statues, possibly looted from a tomb in Luxor. Another shelf contained a velvet box with 6 ancient Byzantine coins, one of which appeared on Interpol's stolen list. There was a medieval gold chalice, adorned with jewels, that had been reported missing from a church in France in 1999. Perhaps the most haunting object in the room was a fragment of a Torah scroll, preserved in glass and showing signs matching a copy believed to have been lost during the Holocaust. Researchers identified it as possibly belonging to a synagogue destroyed during the Nazi regime. And there it was, untouched, silent, like a strange relic. One agent later described the discovery in his official report. "This is not a collection gallery. It is a tomb, a cemetery of stolen history." In total, there were more than 200 items, some small enough to fit in a shoebox, others requiring large crates, each priceless, each without legal documentation. Investigators spent days cataloging the artifacts, calling in historians, art crime experts, and representatives from international cultural preservation organizations. The vault was sealed off, and images of the artifacts were distributed to authorities worldwide. What followed was a wave of confirmations. The Vatican confirmed an item stolen from a monastery in Italy. A museum in Mexico City declared ownership of an Aztec statue that had gone missing a decade ago. The British Museum temporarily linked a stolen fossil to their collection. Even the Smithsonian began conducting an internal audit after seeing images of a Civil War-era diary that matched a missing item from a temporary exhibition. Each new confirmation increased Rick's legal jeopardy. The charges of trafficking in stolen cultural property, which were already serious, now carried an international scope. Governments demanded answers. Cultural organizations issued public statements condemning the illicit trade and veneration of their stolen heritage. Rick's name, once associated with history and education, was now linked to the underground world of artifact trafficking. In court, Pam Bondi referred to the vault as a personal museum of stolen items. The defense quickly countered, arguing that Rick had purchased many items legally through middlemen. They claimed he was unaware of their questionable origins and was merely an innocent buyer deceived by unscrupulous sellers. However, this defense quickly crumbled. Emails that Bondi's team had previously gathered showed that Rick had directly inspected some of the items. In one email about purchasing a centuries-old African ceremonial mask, he wrote, "This item won't pass public scrutiny. Keep it off the books." Another email related to a shipment from South America had a simple instruction: no customs, no receipts. The vault, in its silence, told a story of accumulation, but it also told a story of intent. The items were not placed randomly. They were selectively chosen, treated with respect, displayed as trophies not just for their historical value, but also because no one else could possess them. It was the ultimate contradiction. Rick Harrison had built his brand on making history accessible to the public. But in secret, he was hoarding it. And what the vault revealed went beyond legal violations. It exposed something deeper. A psychological profile of a man obsessed with ownership, not just wealth or fame, but control over the narrative, control over the past. The prosecutors invited a forensic psychologist to explain this mindset. She said, "Some individuals with deep knowledge of history and public admiration begin to believe that they alone are worthy of protecting that history." She added, "It's not just about hiding things, it's about rewriting, owning." This theory was reinforced by a final discovery in the vault: a leather-bound journal. The journal bore Rick's signature and contained personal notes about some of the items in his collection. One entry described purchasing a stolen 17th-century telescope. Another entry showed excitement over buying a Roman dagger through an untraceable transaction in Istanbul. "These people don't appreciate what they have," one line read. "I do. I know how much it's worth." This line became the prosecutor's slogan. And for the jury, it was a shock. The secret vault had shifted the balance of the trial. It wasn't just physical evidence. It was a metaphor brought to life. The truth that had been hidden was finally exposed. Rick Harrison had not just crossed a line. He had buried it underground and locked it away. From that moment on, there was no turning back. No more doubt, no more excuses. The vault was not just a crime scene. It was a confession. And the world would never see Rick Harrison the same way again. It all began like a typical day in court. The walls were the same, the judge remained calm, and the courtroom was filled with reporters, legal analysts, and curious onlookers. But there was a different kind of tension in the air, a collective breath held in anticipation. Everyone knew something big was coming, and they were right. This was the day the prosecution would drop the bombshells, the bombs that could shake the entire courtroom, silence the defense, and make headlines worldwide. Rick Harrison, once the face of mainstream reality TV, was no longer simply standing trial. He was about to become the symbol of how fame, unchecked power, and criminal schemes could collide in the most extraordinary way. Pam Bondi began the session with a new witness, one who had not been on the original list disclosed to the defense. A surprise. Judge Elkins, after a brief discussion, allowed the testimony to continue. The witness, Andre Duca, a former European antiquities dealer who had supplied Rick with high-value historical items, made the appearance all the more shocking because he had disappeared from the antiquities world 5 years ago after being accused of trafficking looted artifacts from Syria. He had avoided prosecution by cooperating with Interpol, but his whereabouts had remained unknown until now. Bondi called him to the stand, and the courtroom fell silent. Under oath, Duca confirmed what many had only speculated. Rick Harrison was not just a buyer. He was an active participant in the illegal trade network. "I didn't go to him," Duca said. "He came to me. He knew what I had. He knew those items weren't clean, and he didn't care." He continued recounting a meeting in Barcelona, in a dimly lit room, at a private auction house, where Rick had purchased 4 rare manuscripts, one of which was believed to have been stolen from an archaeological site in Syria. The payment was made in a briefcase containing $90,000 in cash, with no contract, no receipt, and no questions asked. Bondi proceeded to show Duca emails, including one from Rick. "As long as it's real, I don't care where it comes from." That moment changed everything. The defense quickly objected to Duca's reliability, but the damage was already done. The jury had witnessed the true nature of a transaction in the shadows. Rick was not just a pawnshop owner or reality TV star, but a pursuer of history as a commodity to be trafficked. The second bombshell came in the form of surveillance audio. Pam Bondi had obtained recordings from a confidential informant, Rick's former associate, who had worn a recording device during a series of meetings in Las Vegas 2 years prior to the trial. The informant, referred to only as Subject K, had met with Rick on multiple occasions to discuss deals. The audio played in court revealed damaging conversations. In one recording, Rick was heard saying, "We keep the big ones quiet. No show, no records, just us." In another, "Some things are worth more because they're outside the system. Museums don't get that. They bury them. I display them." The voice was unmistakable, calm, confident, even proud. A man not cornered, but in control of the situation. But the recording that truly brought him down was one that seemed harmless at first. The informant had asked Rick about a particularly valuable Native American ceremonial headdress, a sacred item reported stolen from a tribal museum 2 decades ago. In the recording, Rick responded, "That's not for sale, it's mine." When asked why, he sneered and said, "Because no one else will ever have a chance to touch it again. That's why." His words were cold, ruthless, and, for many, unforgivable. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. Native American community members seated in the back stood up and silently walked out, clearly shaken. Rick sat still, his eyes no longer clear, his jaw clenched. As the recording ended, he seemed smaller, as if diminished. The mask had finally shattered. Then came the emotional climax of the trial. Pam Bondi, with impeccable timing, called an unexpected witness to the stand. Joseph Harrison, Rick's younger brother. Unlike Corey, Joseph had never appeared on Pawn Stars. He had stayed away from the spotlight, choosing a quiet life in Arizona. But in recent years, Their relationship had become strained. Joseph had contacted Rick about an item their late father had given him, a Navy medal from Vietnam, passed down as a family heirloom. That item, Joseph testified, had mysteriously disappeared from his home during a family gathering. Months later, he saw a medal that looked strikingly similar on an episode of Pawn Stars. "I called him," Joseph said. "I asked him if he had it. He told me I was imagining things." Bondi played the clip from the show on the courtroom screen, pausing it. There it was. The medal, with the same engraving on the back, the same faded ribbon. "You stole it from your own brother," Bondi said, looking directly at Rick. Rick's lawyers objected, but the silence in the courtroom was palpable. The jury was not only horrified, but felt betrayed. If he could lie to his own family, what else could he do? Finally, the trial ended with a strategic move by Bondi, allowing Rick to speak for himself. Despite his lawyer's advice to remain silent, Rick chose to address the court. He believed he could still control the narrative, that he could persuade everyone. But when he stood up, took a deep breath, and began to speak, something unexpected happened. His voice trembled. He tried to explain that it was all a misunderstanding, that he hadn't known, that he had trusted the wrong people, that everything had gotten too big and too fast. But as he spoke, his composure cracked. The entire courtroom stared at Rick Harrison, the man who had never blinked on television, who had never backed down in a deal, now crumbling. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," he said, tears streaming down his face. I got too deep. I thought I could handle it." He couldn't finish the sentence. He turned to look at his family, his son, his brother, his old friends, and saw only empty stares. His voice broke again. "I'm sorry." But it was too late. Pam Bondi stood slowly, saying nothing, no grand speech. She simply said, "The truth has spoken for itself." And indeed, it had. The courtroom had now become a stage, and Rick Harrison had just performed the most devastating act of his life. Not as a TV star, but as a man undone by his own choices, his arrogance, and his refusal to listen, until the truth came down like a hammer. When the court adjourned that day, no one had any doubts about the outcome. The bombs had dropped, and Rick Harrison would never be able to piece the fragments back together. Thank you for watching the video. Rick Harrison's situation will certainly make many people reflect. If you want to stay updated on the latest developments, be sure to follow the channel so you don't miss any information. Don't forget to share this video if you found it interesting. See you in the next videos.